Have you ever had one of those moments like maybe you're lying in bed right on that razor's edge between being awake and falling asleep?
Oh, yeah, the weird twilight zone of your brain.
Exactly. Or, maybe you're just staring out the window of a train and this thought forms in your head and it is absolutely brilliant.
Like a total revelation.
Yes. I'm talking about a concept or solution, like this complex architecture of an idea that makes total flawless sense in your mind.
The logic is just pristine.
Right. The connections are all firing perfectly. You can practically see the geometry of the thought. But then, and this always happens, you open your mouth to try and explain it to the person sitting next to you, and suddenly it just sounds like absolute madness.
It completely falls apart.
You stumble over the words, the structure collapses, and what felt like a world-changing revelation just comes out sounding like a jumbled mess of half-baked nonsense.
It is a universally agonizing experience, honestly. It's like you are holding this perfectly cut diamond in your mind, but the friction of pushing it through human language turns it into gravel by the time it reaches someone else's ears.
That's a great way to put it.
The architecture of the thought simply doesn't survive the translation into vocabulary.
And it leaves you wondering, right? Was the idea actually flawed from the start, or is there just something fundamentally broken about how we communicate our deepest, most cutting-edge thoughts?
Right.
That incredibly frustrating, deeply human friction is the gateway into what we are exploring today. We're doing a deep dive into a fascinating, dense, and frankly, highly philosophical document titled The Translation.
And it really is a fascinating source. It sits right at the intersection of human intelligence, the historical structures of power, the whole philosophy of open source technology, and, like you said, the sheer struggle to communicate concepts that exist at the absolute outer edges of human knowledge.
It reads less like a traditional technical manual and much more like a manifesto on the nature of understanding itself.
Yeah, exactly. And we are tracing a very specific journey today for this deep dive.
We're starting by looking backward, right? Unpacking how society has historically weaponized its brightest minds.
Right, the historical trap. Then we are pivoting to the present, exploring the modern opportunity we have to completely bypass those traditional gatekeepers.
Which is super relevant right now.
Totally. And finally, we're arriving at the ultimate, incredibly ambitious goal laid out in the translation, which is building a digital Rosetta Stone.
Creating a mechanism in code to make the most complex, mind-bending physics entirely and intuitively understandable to anyone.
It's wild. But before we can understand the ultimate goal of translating knowledge, we have to pull back and look at why knowledge has historically been locked away, or mistranslated, or hoarded in the first place.
Yeah, let's start there, because there is a historical pattern identified in the text, and it's a dark one.
It really is.
Throughout history, whenever someone aligned with a truly different way of thinking, or whenever someone possessed truly cutting-edge intelligence, they almost inevitably got snatched up by what the source calls the machinery of power.
Because intelligence, in this framework, has rarely been allowed to exist simply for the sake of human flourishing.
No, not at all.
It has historically been treated as a resource to be captured. So, as people historically excelled in their fields and reached the absolute edge of what was currently known, they were drawn, sometimes willingly, sometimes through pure economic necessity, or even coercion toward offense and defense.
Right. Their intellect was redirected away from the stabilization of humanity as a whole and funneled directly into managing threats.
Exactly.
Think about it like how a massively dominant corporate sports team operates.
Okay, I like this analogy.
This is a generational talent out there, right? An athlete who fundamentally changes how the game is played. The dominant team doesn't just draft that athlete to score points.
They draft them to guarantee the opposing team doesn't get them.
Exactly. If you can articulate and embody ideas at the edge of human capability, the dominant machinery of power absorbs you just to maintain their competitive edge. It just becomes this perpetual arms race of intellect.
That analogy captures the capture mechanism perfectly. If someone had that edge, they were absorbed by whoever needed that edge to stay on top.
Yeah.
But this introduces a profound systemic barrier to true innovation. The text refers to this as the funding trap.
The funding trap, right.
When you are funded by a power structure,
Yeah.
whether that's a government, a military apparatus, or a massive conglomerate, you are implicitly agreeing to only go as far as a funder's interest reaches.
Which makes sense from the funder's perspective.
Sure, but the core critique here is that no one in power funds the thing that removes their need for power.
Let me push back on that for a second, though, because that sounds, a bit too absolute.
How so?
Well, surely there are institutions designed specifically to avoid that trap. What about universities?
Academia.
Right. We pour billions of dollars into higher education and pure research grants precisely to create safe havens for completely untethered thought. Like, academic tenure literally exists so that brilliant minds can't be fired for exploring disruptive ideas. How does the university not solve the funding trap?
It's a great question. Tenure is a fascinating defense mechanism to bring up. But let's break down the economics and the psychology of how someone actually achieves tenure.
Okay.
By the time a researcher is granted that ultimate protection, they have spent a decade or more proving their worth to the institution.
Right. They have to ground.
And how do they prove their worth? By securing continuous grant funding, publishing in journals controlled by established paradigms, and elevating the prestige of the university.
Ah, I see.
So the traditional path of ending up in a university setting doesn't insulate you from the machinery of power. It just puts you in a different gear of that same machine.
But wait, once they have tenure, they are free, right? I mean, they can research whatever they want at that point.
Free to research, perhaps, but they still operate within an ecosystem that demands certain types of outputs. The institution's fundamental priority is still the stabilization of its own current power dynamics.
Because they still need money.
Exactly.
Hmm.
A university needs prestige, alumni donations, and continuous federal or corporate grant funding to keep the lights on. A corporation needs quarterly profits and market share.
Right.
So if a researcher discovers a slightly more efficient way to generate electricity, the institution will fund that endlessly because it integrates into the current economic model. It makes them money or brings them prestige.
Okay, I see where this is going. If that same researcher wants to develop, say, a completely free, infinitely renewable energy source that anyone can build in their backyard from scrap metal,
The funding dries up.
because that discovery doesn't elevate the university's prestige in the eyes of energy conglomerates. It destroys the conglomerates entirely.
Precisely. You are funded to iterate on the current reality, not to overthrow it. You become a tool to bring power to whoever is writing the checks, and your innovation stops exactly at the boundary of their comfort zone.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that is a trap.
But we have to ask why power needs this relentless control in the first place. The insight offered by the text here is that power requires control because so many different versions of humanity are trying to run at the same time instead of working together.
Multiple versions of humanity trying to run at the same time. Let's really chew on that for a second. We're essentially talking about competing operating systems.
Exactly. You have different nation states, different economic ideologies, and different cultural paradigms all trying to assert dominance, or at the very least, ensure their own survival on the same planet.
Which is a finite space.
Right. Because they are fundamentally competing for finite resources and ideological supremacy rather than collaborating, the baseline state of human interaction is underlying friction.
It's a baseline of fear.
Yes, exactly. A baseline of fear.
Because we are operating on these competing systems, survival forces all high-level intelligence back into a defensive category. Like, you can't just invent a beautiful new technology for the good of all, because version A of humanity is terrified that version B of humanity will weaponize that technology and wipe them out.
Which brings the entire dynamic full circle back to the capture of intelligence.
Right.
If humanity is fragmented and competing, then any breakthrough at the edge of knowledge is immediately viewed through a lens of threat assessment.
So the smartest people are recruited to manage that threat.
Exactly. They are pulled away from stabilization like holistic, universal human progress and forced to play the zero-sum game of offense and defense.
Think about this in your own life for a second, just as a listener. Have you ever had to compromise a pure, innovative idea to fit the narrow goals or the anxieties of a boss, a client, or an investor?
Oh, almost everyone has.
Right. You have this grand vision for a project that could genuinely change how your industry operates. But your manager looks at it and says, that's great, but how does this help us beat our competitor this quarter?
Exactly. You are experiencing a micro version of this exact capture.
Your intellect is being constrained by the immediate survival needs of the power structure you work for.
And for all of recorded history, the greatest minds have been trapped in this cycle. But, and this is where it gets hopeful, the era we are living in right now provides a fundamentally new loophole, a way out of the machinery.
Yeah, let's pivot to that. Because if survival and power dynamics have historically trapped intelligence, how do we actually break the cycle? The reality we exist in today, the whole digital architecture of our modern world, has created a totally unprecedented opportunity to exist unobserved.
This is a deeply profound paradigm shift, the text points out. Today, it is possible to do groundbreaking work without being forced into physical seclusion by a monarch, and without being forced to harm others for a military apparatus.
Because knowledge isn't geographically locked anymore.
Exactly. Knowledge is no longer strictly governed by physical geography. I mean, there are certainly those who try to hoard it, but what is released freely and publicly is just available. It is out there, and anyone can reach it if they choose to.
Right. Historically, if you discovered a new metallurgical technique for making vastly superior steel, you had to physically build a forge to test it.
You couldn't hide that.
No, you had to physically share the prototype. That meant the local lord or king eventually found out, and suddenly your forge belonged to the military. You couldn't hide physical innovation. But today, the distribution of information has been entirely decoupled from physical control.
And the proposed method in the source for utilizing this loophole is highly specific. It says, sit in seclusion, do the work, release the code, release copyleft documents, and release simulations.
And crucially, do all of this without it being backed by or tied to anyone who requires payment security or power from it.
Right.
For anyone listening who might be unfamiliar, copyleft is a play on copyright.
Yeah, it's a great concept.
It means you release something with the explicit legal architecture that allows anyone to use, modify, and distribute it freely, with the absolute condition that any derivative works must also be completely free and open.
It is a legal virus of freedom.
A legal virus of freedom. I love that. You are seeding the world with open knowledge.
And it is the ultimate subversion of the funding trap. You aren't asking for permission, and you aren't asking for a budget. You are simply injecting the paradigm-shifting knowledge directly into the public bloodstream.
It's like a parallel infrastructure. Usually when a tech company goes into stealth mode, they are hiding their research from competitors so they can eventually launch a product, capture a massive market share, and make billions of dollars.
It's like they're just building their own little machinery of power in secret.
Exactly. But what we are talking about here is existing in stealth mode, not to capture a market, but to bypass the market entirely. You hide from the power structure so you can eventually launch a paradigm-shifting product and give it away for absolutely nothing.
We do have to examine the ultimate goal of giving it away, though.
Yeah.
Because the text is clear. It's not just altruism for the sake of making people smile.
Right. There's a strategic purpose.
The stated goal of this open release is to cancel out fear in society. In fact, canceling out fear is framed as the single most important objective we have.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that because it sounds almost utopian at first glance. Like, how does sitting in a room, writing a complex physics simulation, and dropping it onto the internet for free actually cancel out societal fear?
Well, to understand the mechanism, we have to look back at our competing operating systems of humanity that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Why are those different versions of humanity terrified of each other? They are terrified because of resource scarcity, and more importantly, because of the asymmetrical hoarding of power and knowledge.
Asymmetry.
Right. If Nation A has a massive technological breakthrough, Nation B is terrified because of the asymmetry. Nation A now has the leverage to dictate terms, or to destroy Nation B entirely.
I see. Asymmetry breeds fear. If I have the sword and you don't, you naturally have to be afraid of me.
Exactly.
But if an anonymous individual releases a technological breakthrough simultaneously to the entire globe for free with no strings attached, the asymmetry vanishes.
Precisely. There is no monopoly. You cannot be threatened by a weapon or a tool that everyone has equal access to. The breakthrough ceases to be a weapon of dominance and simply becomes a tool of universal baseline reality.
Wow.
You cancel fear by canceling the asymmetry of knowledge.
But there is a massive caveat here that the text brings up. You cannot dismantle a power structure by fighting it directly.
No, because if you try to fight the machinery of power, you are just engaging in offense and defense again.
You are acting out of fear of that power structure. You are literally playing their game on their board.
And this is why previous attempts at liberation often fail. They try to tear down the existing structure using the tools of the existing structure, violence, economic coercion, political maneuvering.
Right.
The alternative presented here is to completely ignore the game. You don't fight the machinery of power. You simply render it irrelevant by flooding the zone with the knowledge it usually tries to hoard.
It relies entirely on the power of decentralization. By releasing code and copyleft documents publicly, there is no central leader to assassinate.
Right.
There is no corporate headquarters to raid, there is no bank account to freeze, and no required payment to track. It bypasses the traditional threat management systems entirely because there's just nothing physical to grab onto.
We do need to acknowledge a very stark geopolitical reality here, though, one that the translation is keenly aware of.
Yeah, this is important.
This entire loophole relies heavily on geographical privilege, because there are countries where this specific type of unmonitored computational work would immediately flag an observation algorithm.
Right. In certain parts of the world, simply thinking differently, pulling down massive amounts of data, or running complex unmonitored computational work triggers an alert.
You stand out.
Because fewer people are allowed to do it, or because the digital infrastructure of that specific nation monitors its citizens more closely.
It is a profound realization that simply being able to exist unobserved is a luxury.
Yeah.
The ability to sit in a room, do the work, and have it seem fairly insignificant to anyone until it's already changing the world, that is a genuinely unique position.
The privilege of insignificance. I mean, we are so heavily conditioned by social media, by hustle culture, by the entire modern economy to want to be significant, right?
Constantly.
We want to be noticed, to be the shiny object, to be the thought leader. But the argument here is that the ultimate strategic advantage for pure, untethered innovation is being perceived as completely harmless and boring by the powers that be.
If you are perceived as insignificant, you are unobserved. And if you are unobserved, your intellect is free from the defensive posturing required to survive scrutiny.
Think about the open source tools you might use every day. Think about the foundational code of the internet, or massive public archives like Wikipedia. These civilization-altering resources only exist because someone, somewhere, chose the path of insignificance. They chose to exist unobserved, do the work, and give it away, rather than leveraging it to become a target of the machinery.
Let's follow the narrative arc inward now.
Okay.
So you have found this unique geographical and digital loophole. You are in a safe, unobserved space. You have bypassed the funding trap. You are simply existing and producing knowledge. We now pivot from the macro level of geopolitics to the micro level of human neurology.
Which is where things get really weird and interesting.
What actually happens in the mind of the individual sitting in that room when they discover something entirely new?
This brings us to what I think is the most visceral and haunting part of the journey in this deep dive. The exact moment of figuring something out. That spark of a paradigm-shifting epiphany at the absolute edge of human knowledge. The translation describes this moment as an internal, sublingual event.
Sublingual. It literally translates to below or before language.
Let's spend some real time exploring how a thought is born, because the suggestion here is that true, groundbreaking understanding doesn't happen in English or Mandarin or even in formal mathematical equations initially.
No, it happens as a pure pre-verbal realization.
It is the phenomenon of understanding a concept purely through intuition. You might grasp it through a sense of internal geometry or a physical feeling of spatial relationship within the mind, long before any specific words have been assigned to the nodes of that geometry.
You know the truth of it before you can speak the truth of it.
Exactly. The architecture of the idea is perfectly sound, but it is built out of raw cognition, not out of vocabulary.
It really goes back to that analogy we started with, of waking up from a hyper-vivid dream.
Oh, yeah. Let's unpack that.
While you are inside the dream, the logic is absolutely flawless. The way the buildings fold into each other, the way time moves, it all makes profound, beautiful sense. You intuitively understand the physics and the rules of that dream environment perfectly.
But the second you wake up and you sit across from your friend at breakfast and try to force that pure experience through the narrow funnel of human language, the language just shatters the experience.
It does.
You say something like, well, my cart was a toaster, but also it was my mother, and we were driving through the concept of Tuesday.
And it just sounds ridiculous.
Totally ridiculous. The words completely fail to capture the internal reality you experience.
That analogy perfectly highlights the friction. When a person experiences this sublingual realization at the absolute frontier of physics or technology, and then tries to speak it aloud to others, one of two scenarios unfolds according to the text.
Okay, what are the scenarios?
In the first scenario, the idea spreads relatively easily because the language happens to fit the time.
Meaning society has already developed the necessary vocabulary to absorb the idea?
Right.
The culture has done the prep work. The idea is just the very next logical step on the staircase of human understanding, so we already have the words to describe the step we're currently standing on.
Exactly. But the second scenario is where the tragedy lies. If the idea is too far ahead, if it skips several steps on that staircase, the words to describe it literally do not exist yet. The existing lexicon of humanity is mathematically insufficient to convey the reality of what this person has realized.
Yeah.
So when they try to explain it using the inadequate tools of current language, it sounds like madness.
Which leads to this staggering, deeply empathetic observation in the text. Half the time, someone raving on a corner might actually be trying to explain something genuinely simple.
It demands a complete shift in how we perceive communication failures.
Yeah, it really does.
When we see someone struggling to communicate an idea that seems totally disconnected from our shared reality, our immediate instinct is to dismiss them. We categorize them as broken.
Right.
The perspective offered here suggests that what we perceive as insanity might, in some specific cases, be of a profound truth that simply lacks the proper lexicon to survive the journey from their brain to ours.
I have to challenge this a little bit, though, because it's a beautiful thought, but is it really fair to say the problem is never the idea itself?
What do you mean?
Like, we can't romanticize every incoherent thought. Surely sometimes a person raving on a corner isn't holding the secret to quantum gravity. Sometimes raving is just raving. Sometimes an idea is just fundamentally wrong, right?
You're absolutely right, and it's a vital distinction to make. We shouldn't read this as a blanket medical diagnosis, that all mental distress is simply misunderstood genius. That would be reductive and, frankly, dangerous.
Right.
Rather, we need to view this as a philosophical exploration of the absolute limits of human communication.
It's a metaphor for the boundary of collective knowledge.
Precisely. Imagine you are standing at the absolute edge of current knowledge, gazing into a completely unknown dimension of physics. You are seeing colors that don't exist in the standard spectrum. When you turn around to tell the rest of us what you see, you are forced to use our old words to describe your new dimension. You have to use the word red to describe something that is fundamentally not red.
So to the observer who hasn't seen what you've seen, you sound like you are speaking nonsense.
Exactly. The failure isn't necessarily in the observer's intellect, and it isn't in your mind. The failure is in the connective tissue between you. The bridge hasn't been built yet.
Think about a time in your own life when you felt a deep emotional truth, or maybe a really complex intuition about a systemic problem at work. You saw exactly how all the pieces were connected and why the current system was failing. You felt the truth of it in your gut. But when you stood up in the meeting to explain it to your team, it sounded vague or confusing or overly emotional.
Right, the translation failed.
Now, scale that feeling up. Imagine if that intuition wasn't about an office dispute, but held the key to a completely new branch of physics or energy generation. How profoundly isolating would it be to hold the truth of the universe in your head and sound like a fool every time you opened your mouth?
It is the ultimate intellectual isolation, which brings us to the core problem the translation is attempting to solve. If human language is fundamentally insufficient to express these edge-of-knowledge, sublingual truths, what is the actual solution? How do we build the bridge?
And this is where we arrive at the final and, frankly, most wildly ambitious part of our deep dive today.
Yeah, this is the big one.
The text doesn't just diagnose this tragedy of communication. It provides a highly specific, almost awe-inspiring answer. We have to build a new translation layer.
And not just any translation layer. The explicit goal is to create an explanation that works in code, a digital Rosetta Stone for intuitive physics.
Let's break down the mechanics of this, because this is where the philosophy turns into hard execution. The historical Rosetta Stone was a physical artifact, right? It featured the exact same decree inscribed in 3 different scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. Because scholars could read the Greek, they could use it as a parallel translation to finally decode the hieroglyphs, which had been a complete mystery for centuries.
Applying that metaphor here, the high-level cutting-edge math of the universe, like the tensor equations, the quantum field theories, are the unreadable hieroglyphs to 99.9% of humanity.
Including me.
And me.
Mm.
It looks like beautiful nonsense on a chalkboard. We need a parallel translation. Code, meaning interactive software and simulations, is the Greek. It is the medium that can translate the abstract mathematics into an understandable, interactive experience.
But the goal isn't just intellectual understanding, right? The source specifies a Rosetta Stone for intuitive physics.
That word intuitive is key.
Right. The aim is not just to make you memorize the math, but to translate it so that you can hear it the way you need to hear it from wherever you were starting, and let that math turn into something physical.
Right. But what does it actually mean to take abstract equations and turn them into a visceral physical feeling?
Think about how you understand gravity on a daily basis. You do not need to know Sir Isaac Newton's law of universal gravitation, and you certainly don't need to understand Albert Einstein's field equations for general relativity to know exactly how a tennis ball is going to bounce if you drop it on the sidewalk.
Right. My brain just automatically calculates the parabolic trajectory. I intuitively understand the physics of the macro world because my physical body interacts with it constantly. My brain has built an internal model of those rules.
Exactly. Your brain is a master physics engine for the specific environment it evolved in.
Yeah.
But when we get to quantum mechanics or relativistic speeds or higher dimensional non-Euclidean geometry, our physical intuition completely fails. The math says one thing, but our bodies and brains have absolutely no frame of reference for it.
Like a particle existing in two states simultaneously feels like a logical paradox, even though the math proves it is true. The math feels abstract, like a language we simply don't speak. So how exactly does computer code bridge that gap? You were asking earlier, are we talking about virtual reality, a video game simulation? How do we build a user interface for reality?
Yeah, how does that work practically?
We have to look at how modern physics engines in video games already work.
Okay.
When you play a complex video game, the computer is constantly running massive mathematical calculations regarding gravity, momentum, light refraction, and collision detection.
Yeah.
But you, the player, never see the math.
Right, I just see my digital character jump across a chasm.
The code takes the raw mathematics and renders it into a visual interactive simulation.
Oh, I see. I don't calculate the physics of the jump. I just press the A button at the right time. And within 10 minutes of playing a new game, my brain naturally adapts to the specific physics of that digital world. I intuitively know how high my character can jump.
Now, apply that exact same mechanism to the absolute edge of human knowledge. Instead of trying to teach you the advanced calculus and linear algebra required to understand how particles interact in a quantum field, the code just puts you inside a simulation of a quantum field.
Oh.
It renders the abstract tensor equations into an interactive environment.
Yep.
You get to play with the particles, you bounce the quantum tennis ball over and over again until your brain simply builds a new intuitive model.
So you bypass the need for formal mathematical language entirely.
Exactly. Your brain learns the new physics the exact same way it learned gravity when you were a toddler, through interactive observation.
That is staggering. The code takes that impossible, lonely, sublingual event that the genius experienced in their mind, and it builds a digital room. It invites you to step inside and experience that exact same sublingual event for yourself.
Yes.
You don't have to learn the genius's language. The code translates the reality directly into your intuition.
And notice the brilliance of the customization aspect. The goal is to allow you to hear the math the way you need to hear it from wherever you're starting.
Right.
True translation isn't a one-size-fits-all textbook. A textbook forces everyone to learn through the exact same sequence of two-dimensional words on a page.
But an interactive code layer can dynamically adapt to the user. Like, if you are starting from a background in music, maybe the code translates the quantum physics into harmonic frequencies and audio feedback.
Oh, that's a great example.
Or if you are a highly visual learner, it translates the equations into shifting colors and geometric shapes. It meets the listener's unique neurological perspective.
It turns all of it into something physical. That is the closing promise of the translation. By turning the abstract mathematics into an interactive physical simulation via code, we completely remove the barrier of language. We solve the problem of the raving prophet on the corner.
Imagine what that would mean for the trajectory of humanity. To step into a simulation and instantly feel the reality of relativity, the same way you instinctively know how to catch a thrown baseball.
It's incredible.
It democratizes the very edge of human knowledge. It takes the brilliance that the machinery of power has historically tried to capture and hoard, and it beams it directly into the intuitive understanding of anyone, anywhere, with an internet connection.
It is a breathtaking vision for the future of knowledge sharing. It completely reframes the entire journey we have just taken in this deep dive. We are no longer trapped by the limitations of our vocabulary.
Let's synthesize this incredible journey because we've covered a massive amount of ground.
We really have.
We started by looking at the somewhat chilling historical reality of how the machinery of power has systematically trapped and weaponized the brightest minds. High-level intelligence was drafted into a zero-sum game of offense and defense, right? Caught in a funding trap where power stubbornly refuses to finance its own obsolescence.
Right. And then we explored the modern rebellion against that system. The realization that the decentralized nature of the digital age allows us to opt out, to work in unobserved seclusion, leveraging the privilege of insignificance, and to give paradigm-shifting knowledge away for free.
And we do this to cancel out the asymmetry of knowledge, which in turn cancels out the fear that drives the machinery of power in the first place.
Exactly.
From there, we dove into the deeply lonely, sublingual nature of human thought. We explored the tragic reality that without the right language, a profound universal truth can just sound like a broken person raving on a street corner simply because they skipped too many steps on the staircase of societal understanding.
And finally, we arrived at the grand mission, building a digital Rosetta Stone, creating a dynamic translation layer in code that can take the most complex, abstract math of the universe and render it into interactive physical intuition, meeting every single human being exactly where they are.
It's a roadmap from the hoarding of intelligence by the few to the ultimate democratization of understanding for the many. And it leaves me with one final haunting thought.
Let's hear it.
It's a question inspired by the philosophy of the translation, but taking it one step further into the real world for you to mull over today. If this entire theory is right, if all it takes is the right interactive translation layer to turn what sounds like madness into intuitive physics, then what incredible world-saving leaps in human understanding are already sitting in our history, completely ignored, just because we haven't built the Rosetta Stone to decode them yet?
Wow.
How many brilliant sublingual truths are trapped in old, discarded texts or dismissed in the margins of history as the ramblings of madmen, just waiting for the right code to make us intuitively feel what they meant?
That is a profound question.
So next time you hear an idea that sounds completely crazy, or the next time you are struggling to articulate that perfect diamond of a thought in your own head, ask yourself, is it madness? Or are you just missing the translation?